Hello, welcome back to our color analysis. It's already our fourth lesson that covers the subject of color, arguably the foundation of our craft. We pay attention to different things related to color, and suddenly our eyes start to function differently. We reprogram ourselves in a certain way to look at the same work differently. And at this stage, it should be rather obvious that you need to have a certain potential in your composition. Our images won't resonate in colors if they don't first resonate in the geometry, if they don't resonate in composition. Simply put, if the composition is boring, the image will not be interesting. That's why today we are going to look at our images from a broader perspective. We will tell you how to look at them, to know if there is something interesting in them or not. We'll tell you about the relationships between objects and materials. We'll also tell you about color palettes. Lots of cool stuff, and maybe that's a lot to digest at once. But don't worry, it will be rather a simple concept. If you have problems with composition and color palettes, this will be an ideal start. So let's go right into it. We have a collage of photos from our invited stars, which are really on a high level, both in terms of composition and color. Now, let's try to answer one simple question first. What makes an image become more or less interesting? Is it a matter of taste, or is it objectively possible to point out some aspects that work towards it? And it turns out that this is possible, and we will use the language of contrasts to describe it. It might sound weird, but we'll make our case soon. There are many different contrasts inside your images, even though you might not be aware of them. Some of them are obvious, some less so, some more important and extensive, and some less important and quite trivial. Contrast in geometry, the contrast in organic shapes, contrast in detail frequency, saturation, hue, and tonal contrast. Various different contrasts can be identified in each image. If they are in your images, it means that you have a chance for something cool. If you have absolutely none of them, chances are your rendering might be just not interesting. You'll understand what we mean in just a moment, but right away, we want to inspire you to think about contrast in a slightly different way. Contrast will determine the hidden potential in your composition. So let's go through them step by step. The first new use of the word contrast applies to our composition. It's called a geometric contrast. Geometric contrast is a very big part of the composition, and you have surely encountered it already. Even if you haven't, it goes as follows. Anytime you make an image, just mark the basic shapes of the most important objects, like so. As you look at those basic shapes, you will quickly begin to notice certain relationships. At a general level, some works will be very simple relationships of solids or shapes. At a general level, you will have a relationship in geometric contrast between objects. There will be something large with something small, thin with thick, round with sharp, and whatever the geometric relationships, they should be somewhat interesting. Don't expect an award-winning image if you have a single square in your composition. All the contrasting geometric elements will build a certain potential, which will echo in colors later on. So, every time you approach a composition, think about this aspect. Look at the different references and break them down in this very simple manner. Combine big with small. Place something geometrically smaller next to your architecture. Often a car in a strategic location will make the frame much more dynamic. Contrast in sizes are pretty easy to set up, so you don't want to miss the chance to do it. Look at this example. We have several repeating buildings, but we can place a camera so that one of them contrasts with the others. And it's a very easy way to set up the contrast in size. A couple more geometric contrasts over here too. You can combine sharp elements with round or rounded ones. And you know, it's not a lesson about composition per se, though we strongly encourage you to explore the geometry of composition. It's a must-have for becoming a better 3D artist. But for now, we just want you to be sensitive to the word contrast. You can evaluate an image with the language of contrast, even if you don't know exactly how to build them yet. And as you can guess, this lesson would be a little bit different. It will be like a cheat list to point out certain things in your images. It will help you understand what's going on inside your composition and how to articulate it to others, to be able to talk and align with your junior colleagues or clients. Sometimes it might be hard to talk about the same thing, and breaking the picture down like this helps to push the dialogue further. Okay, now let's move on to the next use of the word contrast. It will be an organic contrast, the most common contrast in your compositions, especially in architecture. It is nothing more than combining man-made elements with something of a natural origin. Often, it can be just such straight forms surrounded by trees, boulders, some stones, and clouds. For example, here we have a juxtaposition of man-made elements and organic shapes that extend naturally here. We generally have boxy shapes combined with these organic ones. This contrast may seem trivial, but it is often missing from the works of many artists, for real. Consider placing a tree in a strategic place, something definite, not some leaves in the corner. Consider having an epic cloud too. You can think bolder about these relationships. Organic contrasts make the images look more interesting, and you can evaluate them fairly easily. Now, both geometric and organic contrast are possible to evaluate in your viewport. When you set up the camera, add or move objects, you can keep the word contrast in the back of your head. The next contrast, though, will apply a little bit later. The word contrast can accompany you through the life of the project. That's right. We will use the word contrast while creating materials as well. And the next one is the texture contrast. Whenever you start rendering an image, just scan through your shaders. Go through woods, rocks, plaster, anything really. And most importantly, try to spot the areas that end up as simple gradients. Perhaps you missed a chance to make your image a bit better there and forgot to apply texture contrast. Let's illustrate it here. We have a before and after comparison over here. The one on the left lacks texture contrast. We don't have this micro detail. But on the right, it looks much better. We can say the texture contrasts are one of the foundations of this image. Without those fine details, our image is not as interesting as it could have been. Same here. We can see that we don't have that many texture details on the left. Lots of sad colors which make the image look a bit boring and artificial. But again, the image on the right looks way better. We end up with a nice, punchy image just because we add the texture contrast. The contrast in this kind of micro noise and this texture is very important. And often, when looking through the works of other artists, you can pay attention to just that. There might be a lack of some kind of plaster texture, a lack of scratches or dirt. All of this is a small brick, but it stacks up in the perception of the image. The language of contrast, it's quite universal one, and you can push it even further. You can try to look for detail, frequency, contrast too. It may sound a little bit funky, but it's a pretty cool concept. It's looking at an image from a broader perspective, but thinking about the details at the same time. Sometimes there might be some areas that should be left without that much detail, so that they can contrast with each other. And let me explain it with this example. we have a high frequency of detail on the ground here. There's a lot going on, leaves, branches, and whatnot. We also have a certain texture contrast on this monolith, but the overall detail frequency reads less than the ground, right? There's not as much micro-detailed noise in the monolith, and certainly there's no detail frequency in the sky. We can see that we have different regions that contrast with each other in terms of detail distribution, and because of that, this whole picture has really a very cool impact. If, for example, this terrain was an ordinary texture, I would assume it would be less successful. The basic floor would blend with our monument. Also, imagine if we had a dramatic clouds here. Well, I think it would be too much. I think it would steal our attention. But right now, I can say, instead of stealing our attention, I can just say that the detail frequency would be even across the image. And that's a valid and objective point you can make. Detail frequency contrast is more advanced, but it's a great concept to balance your composition. And here's an interesting thing. Let's bring the tonal contrast, which we covered in the previous lesson. If you haven't seen that lesson, we strongly encourage you to do so. By the way, another use of the word contrast, and pretty essential if you ask me. And the interesting thing is that tonal contrast is connected to both texture and detail frequency contrasts. That might seem confusing, but it's really not. It only means that it's better to judge colors in your image after you have all the textures and objects in place. People often approach tonal contrast while not having all the materials and objects in the scene, and this happens very often in the interiors. When people literally just have a wall with basic material, they don't have any plaster materials, decor, or anything there, but all those objects generate shadows, and textures generate details as well. So don't get discouraged if an empty scene doesn't look good. Wait until you're done with the scene and you might get some texture or detail frequency for free. Okay, you can already see that we are layering these concepts, but you don't need to apply every possible contrast to your image. It's another tool to look at an image. If something looks off, you can analyze your image and evaluate those contrasts one by one. You can ask yourself, do I have interesting shapes, relationships in my composition? Do I need or should I ask detail here? The language of contrast can help you make fast decisions and get another perspective. Okay, let's move on because it will get more interesting real soon. Before we move on to different color contrasts, let's talk about one more that's a little funky too. It's called movement contrast. Movement contrast. We want to inspire you to introduce it whenever you can. It's basically something in motion versus something static. It's as simple as that. They stand in contrast with each other, and very, very easily we can build a composition upon it. As we see here in this example, this image would certainly have less dynamism without the character. And by the way, there's a good reason we put those blurred people in our images. I know they bend the rule of physics, but it visually doesn't attract that much attention, yet still build this dynamism. The character would grab a lot of attention if not blurred. You can introduce blurred cars into the scene as well. You can introduce them in post-production, just like the characters. There's a lot of options here. Okay, I hope all of this shows how tangible the language of contrast is. Why should you take a critical look at your composition? We can sometimes move the tree to the left, to the right, and we can bring the camera closer. Maybe sometimes add that geometrical contrast and combine objects in more interesting relationships with each other. Maybe we can introduce organic contrast and place a stone in a strategic place. Maybe some dynamic cloud. You can always add details or remove them. Let's keep an eye on all of this. we always think about the word contrast. Okay, now moving on to the last big segment here. We also want to inspire you to think about contrast when working with color. We have talked about tonal contrast, and now we are going to expand on this topic. We will cover contrast in hues and saturation, but it will have a little twist on it. In general, color is a bit hard aspect to learn. It takes a lot of trial and error and a lot of experience. Practice is the king when it comes to understanding the color. But anyway, we'll try to give you a certain way of looking at the color. We'll also try to demystify color palettes a little bit. You have probably heard of names like complementary color palettes, monochromatic, right? I hope so, because we will flip them into the language of contrast. This concept will help you evaluate the hues and saturation in your images, similar to the memory colors concept. It will be a good start to working with color palettes, even though we won't create them from scratch. And sorry if it all sounds a little bit mysterious at this stage, but you'll see what we mean soon enough. I think it's best to jump into it right away and start using the language of contrast again. Okay, so let's start with the simplest color palette, which is the monochromatic palette. Mono meaning one and chrome meaning color. We have just one color and, should I say, hue here. Don't be confused that monochromatic means black and white. And whenever we approach this color palette, we should end up with as few hues as possible. By the way, we are back in DaVinci's Resolve, where we are showing just the theory of colors. We can see how the colors are reflected in our scopes. And now there are only hues between cyan and blue, and they are squeezed into this line. This means that they are very limited hues here. We can see that these hues are locked in a very narrow spectrum. So, keeping that in mind, we can come back to the language of contrast. Because if you want to pull off this color palette, you need to focus on depth and tonal contrast. Blacks, mid-ranges, whites, basically everything you already know how to implement. This palette won't be successful if you don't have a clear and readable depth. Let's take a look at another example. And this image is quite interesting because our hero is basically here. It's the moon that shines over the foreground. But still, the depth is very readable. We have very dynamic contrast that soften with the aerial perspective. We have a slight hint of this red here, but we can consider this is a basically monochromatic palette. And just to phrase it differently, you can technically have one hue in your image, but the color palette won't come out successfully if your foreground shines like crazy, or there are other problems with tonal contrast. Whenever you approach a monochromatic palette, keep in mind the tonal contrast and depth. Okay, let's go further with this. Let's see an example of another color palette and how the contrast relates to it. We can see that there are slightly more shades than before. We can see there are more hues, definitely more of them than before. This spectrum is wider here. We have everything from yellows all the way up to oranges. And this color palette is called analogous. The colors in this palette are still limited by a certain framework, but let's say there is a jump in hues by about 2-3 steps. We don't want some random greens here, and we don't want to go further with the reds. Okay, so let's return to the contrast. How does the language of contrast help us pull the analog color palette off? And again, we think and come back to tonal contrast. Again, you can see that the depth is perfect here, as it should be. Tonal contrast is the king of contrast, so no wonder. But in this case, there is such an interesting relationship when it comes to saturation. Saturation plays a big role in this color palette. We will have a very large creative freedom if the images are more or less saturated. it will be possible to play with this aspect, unlike the monochrome palette. Certain colors look better if they are bright and saturated, just like yellows. It is impossible to get a dark saturated yellow color because it will automatically turn orange. And as this palette has a few more hues in it, we will be free to play with saturation here. The more we increase the saturation, see that this palette expands. The less, it goes back to analog again. And just so we don't get confused here, we are not dealing with saturation contrast here. The contrast in saturation means we combine something saturated with something desaturated. So it's a little bit different. We still keep tonal contrast in the back of our minds in this palette. And just to make a brief summary, if you think of monochromatic or analog color palettes, keep in mind the tonal contrast. Keep in mind everything we discussed about whites, mid-ranges, and blacks from the previous color analysis. If you haven't seen it, we definitely encourage you to do so. Additionally, remember that these color palettes are a typical case of less is more. Don't worry about memory colors here. Limit absolutely most of the hues and play with composition. We'll be doing a similar scenario in our first lesson with volumetrics very soon. A little teaser here. Nevertheless, let's keep going. We are entering the territory of bicolor palettes, and we will do the same analogy as before. We have a certain palette, and we are wondering how to evaluate it in terms of contrast. And this palette you probably already know very well. The first two-color palette will be the complementary palette. I'm sure you have already heard of it. These are such classic combinations, usually cold with warm. This situation is relatively simple. We are talking about a situation where all the colors go either into one bag, the warm one, or into the other bag, which is cold. We can see from the graph that we have some of the colors perfectly between yellow and red, and the rest between cyan and blue. We have the colors facing opposite direction, and that means they have the greatest possible impact. This particular palette is perfectly complementary. We have these colors very much isolated, almost like monochromatic palettes joined together. And again, we keep in the back of our minds what kind of contrast. And I think you can guess that this is a hue contrast. We need to narrow down our color palette to two opposite hues. We don't have any random greens. We don't have yellows or reds. Everything is perfectly on the opposite axis. We can see another example here. We already have a few more colors appearing, but again, most of the hues contrast with each other, although the saturation is relatively low. There is a nice color impact that this picture has when we isolate these colors and contrast them in hues. Same here. Exactly the same situation here. We have quite obvious hue contrast here. Okay, now you should really focus on a hue contrast here, but there's something more to this palette. We talked about this in the beginning, and it's nice to have geometric, organic, or texture contrast to make any of the color palette really pop, as in this picture. We have a really nice example of organic contrast here. The triangular structure contrasts with the fallen trees and dramatic clouds. You can see that it's easy to describe this image using the language of contrast and how they are intertwined. Let's check another two examples. We have complementary colors, but slightly shifted. It doesn't always have to be the perfect shade, but the further we pull back, the less impact we will get. It will become much more painterly, which has a great feeling too. We can see that these colors spread out a little bit more, both in terms of cold and warm. So, circling back here, whenever you shoot for a complementary color palette, think about two things. narrow down your selection of hues and put them opposite to each other. You might want to use references for that or help yourself with the color wheel. The more isolated the colors, the bigger the impact this palette has. Another small mental note here is to include some compositional contrast. Think about the shapes, textures, and detail frequency. All of that we covered before. Keep the word contrast at the back of your head at every time. Okay, let's move on. This is such an interesting case. We have another two-color palette, but it's not complementary palette. It's certainly not monochromatic and analogous. Let's see what's going on here on our scopes. And we can kind of say this palette is analogous, but with a small twist. It has one fundamental difference. There is a certain gap between the border hues, and this is why this palette is called a split palette. And this palette will beg you to narrow down the colors. We have neutral colors coming from the overcast, which covers most of the image. The wood is enclosed in a single hue here, and the same goes for the greenery that is here. Everything is separated in terms of geometry. So, back to the subject of contrast, I think you can already guess that the hues will contrast with each other again. But this example is a little bit different than before. They don't have to be on the opposite sides of the axis at all. As long as those colors are narrowed down, they will still have a nice impact. Let's look at another example here. Even without such definite geometric compositions, we are still able to build this color palette. Here we have some dried leaves in the foreground, and they bleed organically toward the more vivid ones. But if we look at our scopes, we can still notice a certain gap here, and even a small gap is enough to build this color palette. It's more challenging to pull it off when the colors are intermingled, but it's possible. Let's check one more example, which takes this color palette to a whole new level. Again, we can see from the graph that there is a certain gap here, but when it comes to the geometric core, the colors dance with each other as much as they can. The contrast in hues are basically shown to us only by the scope. To the untrained eye, it may seem that there is no hue contrast at all, but it is very subtle, and for good reason. This type of palette is difficult to master. We don't have the whole color wheel at our disposal. We work on a narrower spectrum of hues. In a complementary palette, there is room for error, and we can make it a little more or less punchy. But here, tweaking and adjusting those hues with selective color might be a nightmare. So I hope you get a better feeling of how strong geometric contrast might help you to control and pull off different color palettes. Okay, this will be the last palette we'll discuss, although there are some more. By now, we hope that you like the concept of contrast, what to pay attention to, and how to evaluate your images. Remember that the name of the palette is just a mental note for the contrast. Okay, now we have a palette with 3 main colors on the fork, and right away we can see how perfectly they were isolated, and how they create a very pleasant impact and contrast in hues. The greens and warm woods contrast with the cool shades of the sky. We also have organic contrast, of course. We get a nice outline of the plants, the composition is clear, and the colors are such a little icing on the cake. And here, as you can guess, it's nice to have a strong composition, so that it has something interesting in it. If we have chaos in geometry, then the chaos in colors will be hard to tame. The depth has to be well executed as well. Tonal contrast needs to be mastered, as always. We don't need to mention it here anymore. But one thing we want to add is, such a palette is worth practicing at every opportunity. This is quite an advanced palette, but the combination of green, sky, and wood are downright memory colors. See, we have more examples here, and you can see how these colors are distributed across the scopes, and each of them more or less pulls in the same direction. Some shift more toward blue, some more toward cyan, but many artists go for similar hues. It's useful to have that mental benchmark in your head of those hues. The split complementary color palette, because it's the name for it, is going to be very, very common in commercial work, and it's worth having it just in the back of your head. Once you get the concept of memory colors into your blood, this palette will be a natural progression in understanding colors and color contrasts. Okay, let's have a brief recap here and slowly bring this lesson home. So, colors often come out spontaneously, but that doesn't mean you cannot bend them, shift them, and adjust them to some of the patterns. It's not just the name complementary or monochrome or whatever. It's more like a mental shortcut to make these colors isolated and matched so that they contrast with each other. Also, palettes are closely related to composition. They are embedded in it. And the most beautiful colors will shine the most if they first appear in geometry and composition. And for all of this, you can always keep the word contrast in the back of your head. So, before we end, let's do a little more analysis of the work of our stars from the beginning of this lesson. We are revisiting these images, and a lot of them have some interesting contrasts with each other. We are certainly able to identify some of them now. The easiest one would be just this organic contrast. See, those trees here immediately build an interesting potential. Nice and strong elements. Oftentimes, artists avoid such a bold move, but you can definitely experiment with it. It really makes a difference. We also see how we can add a cloud that instantly builds the composition. If we gave a simple gradient, we wouldn't have that powerful composition. Here, for example, on the other hand, we have a simple gradient, but we can see what a great impact just this organic stone is making all around. And that was completely enough. We can also see the frequency of detail. There is more detail here, and this is why this architecture really stands out. We can also see how the geometric elements are juxtaposed with those sharp ones. All of this can be analyzed and looked at and focused on, because it will build our image for free. When it comes to colors, we can also say a little bit about that here. We can again note that here, for example, we have a split color palette. It is a pretty unique color palette. The greens have been reduced to one shade, and they contrast with this nearby orange. They skip over those yellows somewhere in there. And if there were more of these colors, this picture wouldn't have made such an impact. And in addition, we still have tonal contrast, which is resolved really masterfully. By the way, we can see that in each of these examples, the tonal contrast is just great. We also have a 3-color palette here. It also creates a certain trinity and makes a very cool impact. We can see how everything stays in contrast with the cool tones. Also, it should be pretty obvious that we have a complementary color palette here. Nicely isolated colors stand out on the opposite sides of the color wheel. Everything can be analyzed and brought down to valid, objective points. You can actually describe in words why this is interesting. Okay, this lesson was rather unusual, but we hope it inspired you to look at your images differently. Sometimes you can be bolder with your composition and with color. The language of contrast allows you to see and evaluate this. Tonal contrast, contrast in hue, contrast in saturation, geometry, texture, movement, and organic forms. These are all little puzzles, and they will eventually assemble in something bigger. Try to identify them in the works of others. and you'll see what the images are made of. Now you know what to pay attention to, and I hope this will be the beginning of such a journey, both with form and color. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.